my mum is like pretty bang on like median boomer in terms of when she was born, and it feels like she had a sort of fairly average, I guess, boomer life. Her and my dad both, like, my mum was worked in a nursery. My dad was a police constable in the British Transport Police. So both did sort of like vocational jobs, but like kind of fairly ordinary jobs. Weren't like in management or something, but just kind of like did ordinary, and yet managed to experience like some social mobility, managed to buy a house, managed to get pensions, kind of like, had what we would like maybe consider a vaguely ordinary life, other than obviously having me, which made it spectacular. And so like it felt kind of like a reasonable representation of, if you're going to pick one person and therefore it's always going to be someone's specific experience, it felt like an okay sort of one to go with. My hope is that it adds a kind of humanity to the film as well, because it's like my mum, and so I think the way that I interview her is slightly different to the way I chat to the other people. Yeah. But yeah, it was really interesting. So I called her up and was like, so I'm making this film about like baby boomers and the baby boom. Like I was wondering if you'd be up for being interviewed for it, as like, and we'll come to your house. And she was like, yeah, go on then, we'll see. And we'd had some sort of pre-chat, which was interesting in and of itself, that, yeah, she hadn't, and some of this didn't quite make it through to the actual thing, but there was loads of stuff that when I prompted, like, I'd be like, oh, were there more people at school, or like, did you not notice because you were 5? And she was like, well, no, I didn't notice when I was 5 what the demographic situation was in terms of how many 5-year-olds there were, unsurprisingly. But she was like, when she left school, and then went to teacher training college, and then was becoming a teacher, she was like, oh yeah, it was a thing that there were fewer children, and there was a bunch of us that are trained to be teachers, and like, where would we teach? Because we don't need as many teachers anymore, because like the sort of final bit of the baby boom has kind of like weaned off a little bit. So it was interesting speaking with her and suddenly framing those things and kind of go, oh, did you notice that? And the ways in which suddenly she kind of spotted stuff, which, I mean, as we were saying earlier, like now when you were born feels like a really important thing. And I guess also the thing you were saying about, do you attribute successes or failures to yourself or to, if it feels like when you are born has been a particular sort of point of challenge around your life, you probably are going to be like, oh, I'm a Gen Z and I had to live through the COVID and the wake of the financial crisis and some of this stuff. Or if you are a boomer and you've had a little bit more stability through your life, maybe you don't have to, maybe you go, yes, my life was kind of about my agency. And also you maybe just don't have to think so much about when you were born, because that doesn't feel like a constraining factor, at least.
Yeah, the world revolves around you.
Yeah, to some extent.
But it's interesting that you do this thing with her and you go, let's like say how much our houses were when we bought them, and you show the house value, and hers was like 17,000 and yours was like 250. I hope you don't mind me saying it's on the internet.
It's in the film.
Yeah. And then she goes, what's more interesting is the jobs that we did. Because she then says, I had like quote unquote normal job. And she's like, I don't even know what you do. You've got like quite an extraordinary job, and you need that job just to fulfill the life experience that she did at that age was kind of her point. Do you know what I mean?
She also goes, well, no, in some ways I think she's rationalizing it there in a really interesting, because I think she also she's like, oh, your house is nicer than the one we bought, which I do think is true without like giving them both a review. Our house is a little bit bigger. It's I don't know. It's maybe slightly nicer in some ways. It's damp because it's old rather than because it was badly built. But it's also still a house in Plymouth, right? It's not.
It's below the median house price of the UK as well. Yeah, which I think is important to say.
So
that's depressing.
Yeah, that was like the limit. So that was like the limit of Me and my wife's helped buy ISAs.
You're a successful YouTuber, one of the biggest in the UK, and you buy a mouldy house in Plymouth. That's the kind of media value. That's the modern.
But like, well, I mean, that's, you know, when you talk about this job, you know, you sitting there interviewing me, like, if you were doing that job 30, 40 years ago, you would be like
a celebrity.
Like a
really big celebrity.
I was trying to think of a TV presenter, but the only one I can think of is not a great one now. Who's like a BBC News?
You're like Jimmy Savile.
I was about to say.
I was like, you'd be like Hugh Edwards, and I was like, I don't.
Oh God!
Who's
Jimmy Savile.
Hugh Edwards is like.
Who's like a Trevor
Parky.
McDonald? Yes, you would be Michael
Trevor
Parkinson.
McDonald.
Okay, you'd be Parky. That's a good.
So far, no, we don't know.
So like, yeah, and again, that comes back to that sort of like the jobs that seem spectacular in their eyes maybe are a bit more routine, right?
Yes. Yeah, because they were, you know, like one thing that my mum would always say is that TV presenters back then were like rock stars, whereas now it's. I mean, the amount of people that I meet that are like, oh, I'm a social media influencer. It's kind of shocking. But and obviously I mix in the circles, but I encounter people, or when I know someone, they're like, oh, my mate is this and this. It's becoming more normal. It's like, you know, it's not like this rare thing. Lots of people do it, you know, and more people are doing it.
Particularly not spectacular, I guess.
Not to the level that you're like a household name. I'm by no means a household name. You know, you could have 10 million people following you and not be a household name. Yeah. In the modern world, which is crazy.
Yeah. It's fascinating. To come back to your point, so it was interesting to see her kind of like trying to rationalize it in a way that maybe made some sense, but didn't entirely account for like quite the difference. Because you sort of want to be able to explain that. Like, I think it's difficult to.
It's a defense mechanism almost.
Yeah, which
like,
is
because they get attacked a lot, don't they? The boomers, they get. You had it all. You're so lucky. And
I hope I hope my mum didn't feel attacked in my interview with her, and I think she's like reasonably sort of aware, but it was interesting having the chat like when those things did come through, of just going like, oh well, it's because of this reason, and you're like, maybe a bit, but also just it's very different.
There's a lot of hindsight as well. We know where the boomers have ended up, right? But when you go back to say the 70s and the 90s and high interest rates there was loads of periods that were awful to live through. And I wonder if in 30 years we look at it and, you know, maybe the millennials have ended up okay in a different set of ways, and we're all like, oh, it actually all kind of came out in the wash, you know. And I'm sure the property market's not going to be fixed overnight, and there's going to be issues there. But I wonder if, we extrapolate it out and it's the same. And if we'd have lived through the 70s or the 90s, would we have said, this is amazing? You know, the early 90s and the interest rate rises at 15%, you know, would we have been like, oh yeah, this is all just part of the great life of a boomer?
Quite possibly. I mean, I think the thing we can learn from it is, you know, what were the decisions that were made at a sort of political level that maybe could have seen that life experience continue. Do you know what I mean? Could have seen that trajectory still be something that we could, you know, that we could still have upward social mobility as a kind of broad expectation. You know, not that your life is going to be, not that everyone's going to be a millionaire. I guess money's a limited resource, so it doesn't quite work like that. But you know, that your standard of living could be greater than your parents. And I think until 20 years ago, the broad sense was that was a given, right? That was kind of a broad expectation of life, where now that's kind of come into question. So I think the thing we can learn is, okay, well, why did that happen, and what might we do differently going forward?
This was a clip from our chat with YouTuber Tom Nicholas. To watch the full episode, click right here.